There are some cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Which require you to declare something in order to activate and use their effects. More often than not, these activation requirements want you to declare a card type, attribute, or even the particular mechanic of the card, but there are some cards which are capable of declaring a specific card's name. So in this video, we're going to talk about the best cards and effects that let you declare a specific card's name, why they're so powerful, and why card names are so integral to their particular effect. And at number 10, we have Archfiend's Oath, a continuous spell card belonging to the Archfiend archetype. And it has the effect that on a soft once per turn, by declaring any card name and paying 500 life points, you can look at the top card of your deck. And if you declared the correct card, you get to add that card to your hand. If you did not, then you have to send it to the graveyard instead. Initially, this effect appeared somewhat mediocre. At best, it's an incredibly risky Upstart Goblin. As with Upstart Goblin, you're always guaranteed to draw the card, but with Archfiend's Oath, you need to have the power of divination to always call the top card of your deck correctly. And if you don't, it just gets sent to the graveyard. So, with how risky Archfiend's Oath is for just one card draw, why does it make it onto this list? Well, if there is a way for you to always know what the top card of your deck is going to be, then Archfiend's Oath can actually act as a better Upstart Goblin rather than a riskier one, which is why decks that choose around Archfiend's Oath would often pair it with another continuous spell card called Convulsion of Nature. And all Convulsion of Nature does is make both players flip their decks upside down, exposing the top card of both players' decks at all times. This means that instead of needing to guess the top card of your deck with Archfiend's Oath, you'll always know whatever is on top of your deck and will always be able to add it to your hand. And because the card is a continuous spell card and it has a soft once per turn, you can do this multiple times over the course of several turns to gain a lot of value from the card. This particular strategy actually managed to see a minor amount of competitive play in two separate FTK decks, Life Equalizer FTK and Magical Explosion FTK, where it was used for the explicit purpose of thinning your deck to reach your FTK enablers alongside other deck thinners like Upstart Goblin and Toon Table of Contents, ensuring you always have the max amount of consistency possible. However, the reason why Archfiend's Oath is so low on this list is because in the modern era, this strategy sees zero amount of competitive play. And even in modern FTK decks that are trying to thin their deck as much as possible, there are far better options available that don't rely on a very specific two-card combo. Into the Void, Hand Destruction, and Dark World Dealings, just to name a few. But for what it does, Archfiend's Oath isn't the worst card in the world, and can occasionally be even more beneficial than the now limited Upstart Goblin, which is why it makes the number 10 spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Exosister CarpeDivem, the second continuous spell card on this list, this time belonging to the recently released Exosister archetype. CarpeDivem has 3 effects. One of them is a continuous effect, while the other 2 are activated effects that are hard once per turn for each. The continuous effect is that neither player can target Exosister monsters you control with effects of monsters summoned out from the graveyard. And once per turn, when any attack is declared involving an Exosister monster, you can target a spell or trap card your opponent controls and destroy it. But more relevantly, it also comes with the effect that whenever an Exosister monster is XC summoned, you can declare any card name. And until the end of this turn, you can negate both the activated effects and on-field effects of cards with that name until the end of the turn. Now, this effect is actually extremely versatile, being able to be used both to protect your own plays and stop your opponent in their tracks. On the one hand, you can use CarpeDivem during your own turn while you're setting up your board to protect your plays from hand traps. For example, if you were to XC summon an Exosister Xyz monster using Exosister Michaelis during your own turn while you control a face-up CarpeDivem, you can then declare a particular potent hand trap, such as Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, before your opponent has a chance to activate them, allowing you to use Michaelis' effect to search out without needing to worry about being stopped. Now, for most Xyz decks, XC summoning during your opponent's turn is a difficult task, usually requiring some kind of rank up magic quick play spell card or archetypal trap card. However, every single Exosister main deck monster has the ability to XC summon during your opponent's turn when they move a card out of the graveyard, and Exosister Malfa also lets you XC summon whenever either player moves a card out of either graveyard. So what you can do while you have your CarpeDivem up is figure out what sort of deck your opponent is playing and either wait for your opponent to move a card out of your graveyard while you control an Exosister monster, or alternatively, force a card out of the graveyard with a card like DD Crow or the Transmigration Prophecy while you control Exosister Malfa to then XC summon out an Exosister card. Or you could even use their soon-to-be-released trap card, Exosister Litania. Then you'll be able to activate the effect of CarpeDivem to declare their most powerful playstarter. For example, if you were against Tri-Brigade, you could call Tri-Brigade Fractal in order to stop their hand effects to foolish a Tri-Brigade monster. Or if you were against a hero, you could call Fission Hero Ferris, Element Hero Stratos, or even Polymerization, stopping your opponent's plays completely until the end of the turn. Yet for as strong and versatile as CarpeDivem is, it does come with some downsides, which is why it only makes number 9 spot. In order to get proper use out of this effect, you need a fair amount of setup to ensure that you can activate it in the first place. And in most instances, it relies on your opponent moving cards out of their own graveyard, which they can easily play around if they know what you're up to. And even in Exosister lists, CarpeDivem is just played as a one-of to be searched off of Michaelis if you've already got access to your main playmakers in the form of Exosister Vadis and Litiania, making CarpeDivem even more of a bonus. And speaking of bonuses, at number 8 we have Alsie, the Sylvan High Protector, one of the key boss monsters of the Sylvan archetype and one that has seen a lot of competitive play as a generically strong rank 8 monster. Like a lot of Sylvan cards, it has an ability to activate cards from the top of your deck. In this instance, you declare any card name, activate the top card of your deck, and if you declared it right, you can add it to your hand. And if you declare the incorrect name, you must send that card to the graveyard instead. But it also comes with a bonus effect that if a card is sent from the deck to the graveyard, except during the damage step, you can detach one Xyz material from Alsie and target one card in the field, and put it on the top or bottom of the deck. And both of Alsie's effects have a hard once per turn on them. At first glance, Alsie appears to be much more difficult to use Archfiend's Oath, both of which act as an upstart goblin, with the main difference being that Alsie is a lot more difficult to use, since instead of just activating it from the hand like you would with Archfiend's Oath, you instead have to go through all the trouble of bringing out 2 level 8 monsters in the field in order to use its effect. Yet despite that, Alsie is much stronger than Archfiend's Oath. One part to why is due to a specific mechanic which helped bring Sylvans to meta contention from 2014 onwards: excavation and stacking the top card of your own deck. You see, while Archfiend's Oath need cards like Convulsion of Nature in order to get a random draw, Alsie can use its archetypal tools like Mount Sylvania and Sylvan Charity in order to stack the top cards of your deck with specific cards to not only ensure you always know to guess the correct card, but that it's also a card that you specifically want in your hand off of Alsie. And in the case of a card like Sylvan Charity, you don't even need to stack a Sylvan card specifically at the top of your deck to then add off of Alsie. And what Sylvan players would often do is stack cards such as a limited soul charge to the top of their deck to add off of Alsie's effect, making it much more synergistic than the Archfiend's Oath and Convulsion of Nature combo. But what really drives Alsie over the top is how its failure allows it to synergize with itself and its archetype. In Sylvan, every single main deck monster has an effect that triggers off of being excavated and sent to the graveyard by a card effect. So if you stack Sylvan Peacekeeper to the top of your deck in some way, you can choose to intentionally call an incorrect card, and one that may not even have been in your deck in the first place, to always ensure that Alsie instead sends the top card of your deck to the graveyard, so that you can then access Reborns, MSTs, and even special summons from the deck. But that's not all, because if you choose to call the incorrect card with Alsie with its first effect, you also get to trigger its second effect to put any card in the field on the top or bottom of the deck. Now in Sylvan, you may potentially choose to put one of your own cards to the top of your deck to stack it. But more often than not, this effect was used in order to act as a form of non-destruction removal to clear difficult out boss monsters. And because the card was summonable with any 2 level 2 monsters, it was also played in Blue Eyes and Dark Lord strategies, alongside Sylvan ones, as an important tool in their arsenal, all facilitated by calling the incorrect card on its declaration effect. All in all, Alsie's effect is extremely important to both its particular archetype and even generically, since it can trigger its own removal effect. It can be a hassle to summon as it requires 2 level 8 monsters, and as a result, can be difficult for most decks to make. But once it's on the field, every one of its effects are extremely valuable. And at number 7, we have Psi-Blocker, a level 4 wind psychic type monster with a relatively simple effect. On a soft once per turn, you can declare any card name, and cards with that name and their effects cannot be used until the end of your opponent's next turn. As discussed with CarpeDivem, locking your opponent out of specific cards is incredibly potent, as can be used to stop their playmakers or even hand traps that you're worried about, and the same is true of Psi-Blocker, which can be used in both ways to lock your opponent out of certain cards. In fact, there was a whole FTK centered around using Psi-Blocker. By looping Gigaplants with Super Ally Beast Raptinius on your field, you could work your way into a position where you can continuously keep resummoning out Psi-Blocker over and over, and because Psi-Blocker's effect is only a soft once per turn, on every summon of Psi-Blocker, you could declare a new card name, looping it over and over until you lock your opponent out of all 11,986 cards in the game, after summoning it 11,986 times, and is one of the longest possible FTKs the game has produced. More practically, however, Psi-Blocker has been used as a side deck card in decks that don't need the normal summon, acting as a silver bullet against any strategy. Pendulum and Necron's decks, for example, would often employ Psi-Blockers since they could combo off without a normal summon. So, if you happen to draw Psi-Blocker, you could use it to stop your opponent from using an important hand trap, a board-breaking tool, or to stop them from playing entirely in games 2 or 3 when you know what deck they're playing. What's better is that Psi-Blocker's specific text actually makes it even better than a card like CarpeDivem. CarpeDivem is still quite strong, but it only negates the effects of a particular card name. Psi-Blocker's effect stops the card from being used completely. Not only does this mean the opponent will be locked out of their card's effects, they also can't summon it or set it to the field, or attack, or even use it as material for a summon of an extra monster. So, if you happen to be facing Sky Striker, you can activate the effect of Psi-Blocker, calling Sky Striker Ace Ray to stop your opponent from being able to summon Ray to the field to go into the links, Or if your opponent happens to be playing Branded Despia, you can call Fallen of Albaz to prevent them from going into any of their fusions, which require Fallen of Albaz as a material. It can even be used as a going second tool, as by normal summoning Psi-Blocker, you can just declare the name of one of your opponent's boss monsters that's currently on the field to render it useless until the end of your opponent's turn. In general, Psi-Blocker is an incredible tool that decks should always consider, having applications both with FTKs and in the competitive environment. It does, of course, have some considerable downsides. You need to know what your opponent is playing to properly use this effect, and most importantly, you'll eat up your normal summon. And that's something that a lot of decks can't afford to give up, as their main playmakers are often tied to their normal summon. But for decks that don't need their normal summon, Blocker is an excellent side deck choice for decks that can afford to give it up. If used properly, it can lock your opponent out of playing the game entirely. And at number 6, we have DD Designator, the first normal spell on this list belonging to the DD series of cards, which also houses DD Crow and DD Warrior Lady, but not the D/D archetype. By declaring a card name, you can look at your opponent's entire hand to see if they have the card of that declared name. And if they do have a card of the name, you get to banish it, but if they don't have the declared card, you have to banish a random card in your hand instead. So, if your opponent were to search a card during your turn, you can use DD Designator in order to snipe the card they search from your opponent's hand to make the search worthless. And what's better is that, unlike other cards on this list, DD Designator provides you with the perfect hand knowledge, much the same way as the banned Confiscation and the Forceful Sentry do. You can even use DD Designator to blindly call that one hand trap that would defeat you. A lot of rogue decks, for example, have a hard time dealing with Nibiru the Primal Being, so you could blindly call Nibiru in the hopes that you could banish it. Because in that situation, you either get to banish the Nibiru so you don't have to worry about it, or alternatively, at the cost of banishing a random card in your hand, you get perfect knowledge of your opponent's hand to see what other hand traps you need to play around, or what plays they can make so you can just adjust your board accordingly. Now, despite how useful DD Designator can be against common hand traps, it doesn't see too much modern competitive play, and instead saw a lot of use in early Monarch decks as a way to snipe your opponent's important engine pieces that they could search out with Sandgan and Witch of the Black Forest after destroying them by battle, eliminating the follow-up completely, which was particularly important in slower formats like the ones featured in 2005 and 2007. Designator does come with some unfortunate downsides, however. By rushing in and blindly calling a card incorrectly, you're forced to banish a card from your hand. And because the card you banish has to be random, there's no way to really control it to use it to your advantage and trigger something like Thunder Dragon Roar. And because it's a normal spell, you can't really use it reactively during your opponent's turn after they perform a search. And instead, you have to hope that your opponent simply won't use the card they search so you can banish it during your own turn with DD Designator, making its application somewhat niche. But despite all of that, DD Designator is still an extremely useful card, and one that's very interesting given how its purpose has evolved from dealing with your opponent's plays to dealing with their hand traps, even if nowadays it's more of a niche tech card. Speaking of niche tech cards, and at number 5, we have Lullaby of Obedience, a card with a niche effect that actually managed to see a large amount of competitive play. It's a normal spell card, and by paying 2,000 life points, you can declare the name of any monster in the game, and then, after that, your opponent looks through their deck. And if they have a monster in their deck with the same name, they must reveal it and then make the choice of either letting the person who activated Lullaby of Obedience add that card to their hand, or alternatively, allowing that person to special summon that monster to their field while ignoring its summon conditions. Like DD Designator, Lullaby of Obedience doesn't really see too much competitive play in the modern era. Due to the diversity of modern formats, it's somewhat difficult to know what your opponent is playing while also playing a deck that can gain advantage of what's added to your hand and summoned. That doesn't make the card completely worthless in diverse formats, however, as you can still use it to call fairly common cards that are likely prevalent in most people's decks. Calling a hand trap like Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit or Ash Blossom and Joy Spring will give you access to a free interruption if your opponent chooses to let you add it to your hand. Or a level 3 tuner on board, so you can either perform a single summon of something like Baron de Fleur, or a link summon of Christian Halki Fibrax, essentially resulting in a win-win scenario. But the place where Lullaby of Obedience really shines is in Tier 1 and Tier 0 formats. You see, in these uniform formats, you're more likely to see the same decks over and over again rather than a huge spread of different strategies. And furthermore, you're more likely to be playing that same strategy yourself. This was the case during the 2016 to 2017 Zodiac format, where Zodiac cards were either running rampant on their own or featured heavily as a splash in other decks like Metal Foes, all because of their extreme consistency, splashability, and the strength of their associated boss monster Zodiac Trident, alongside how easy they were to use with Elder Entity Norden, allowing you to combo off while gaining huge amounts of card advantage. And during this format, Lullaby of Obedience saw heavy amounts of play as an option for mirror matches. See, one of the best cards in the Zodiac's repertoire is Zodiac Ratpier, a card currently limited to 1 for how powerful it was. On its normal summon, you could send any Zodiac monster from your deck to the graveyard, either setting up Chaka 9 combos or sending Zodiac combo to the graveyard for recursion. But that's not all, because Ratpier has another equally as powerful effect that any Beast Warrior Xyz monster has as material, gains the effect that once per turn, By detaching any Xyz material, you can special summon out another copy of Zodiac Ratpier from your deck. So with a single Ratpier, you could Foolish a Zodiac card, Xyz summon out a Zodiac monster on top of Ratpier, since all the Zodiac monsters only need one Zodiac monster to be Xyz summoned, and then with the effect that Ratpier gives the monster on top of it, you could summon another one from the deck, and repeat the process another time since both of its effects are soft once per turns, resulting in almost incalculable advantage. The only issue was finding Zodiac Ratpier in the first place. Now, Zodiac did have access to 3 copies of Ratpier for a while, and could even utilize Zodiac Barrage and Fire Formation 10 key to boost their consistency even further, but what they could also do was use Lullaby of Obedience. You see, if you were playing Zodiacs in your deck and your opponent activated Lullaby of Obedience, it was a lose-lose situation for you, as you would either allow them to special summon out your Ratpier, giving them free access to their combo without a normal summon, or you'd allow them to add the Ratpier to their hand, forcing them to normal summon it, but then they get access to Ratpier's Foolish effect. Either way, it allows them to extend while removing one of your Ratpiers from your deck, making Lullaby of Obedience an absolutely astonishing tech choice for mirror matches, as it allowed them to use the effect 3 times natively instead of 2 times, since it basically let them play 4 copies of Ratpier. As mentioned earlier, Lullaby of Obedience is niche in its use, but what it does extremely well, allowing you to easily take advantage of the competitive environment during Tier 0 formats, and even in diverse formats can have some effect where there's strong hand traps around. The card can be incredible, but only if the environment of the meta allows for it. And at number 4, we have Mind Crush, the titular trap card designed to mirror Yamayugi's anime ability to destroy your opponent's mind and dispel all evil from within them. The trap card, however, isn't as dramatic, but it's still pretty powerful. You can activate it by declaring any card name, and if your opponent has any cards in their hand with that same name, they must discard every copy of it. But if they don't, you just randomly discard 1 card from your hand. Mind Crush has the pretty similar utility to the previously mentioned TheDuelLogs. You can use it to force a certain card of your opponent's hand when you know when they have it, and technically speaking, Mind Crush's actual effect is worse than TheDuelLogs, as Mind Crush only sends cards to the graveyard, and has a chance to set up their graveyard with pretty powerful graveyard effects. Meanwhile, TheDuelLogs banishes cards, making it appear stronger at first glance. In the modern era, Mind Crush has even been nerfed now, since you don't even get to look at your opponent's hand to get perfect knowledge of what you need to deal with, while TheDuelLogs provides perfect hand knowledge. Yet despite all of the advantages TheDuelLogs has, Mind Crush is still the better card purely because it's a trap card, and can be activated during your opponent's turn at any point. You see, with cards like TheDuelLogs, you can't use it reactively after your opponent searches a card during their turn. And in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's incredibly important to be able to interrupt your opponent in some way before they have the opportunity to build up their board. TheDuelLogs can't really do this, but Mind Crush can. Because it's a normal trap, you can wait for your opponent to search out one of their key combo pieces and then immediately flip up Mind Crush to call the card you know that they have in their hand. So for example, if your opponent is playing a Sword Soul deck and using Sword Soul Emergence in order to add Sword Soul Strategist Longyuan to their hand, you can immediately force them to send that card to the graveyard before they have an opportunity to use it, making Mind Crush excellent at interrupting your opponent, being able to stop your opponent's cards before they have opportunity to use them. And just like TheDuelLogs, you don't even have to know what your opponent has in particular in their hand in order to get use out of it. If you build up a board, you may be particularly worried about certain board breakers like Dark Ruler No More. But with Mind Crush, you can call Dark Ruler No More before your opponent proceeds to the main phase, allowing you to be safe from a specific card that you're worried about. Now, of course, Mind Crush does have its issues. It's a trap card and can't really be used on your own turn to snipe out back-breaking hand traps that would interrupt your plays in the same way that TheDuelLogs can. And in order to use it, you need a card in hand to discard in case you end up calling an incorrect card. But despite these downsides, Mind Crush more than ears up a spot at the number 4 spot on this list, as it's seen a huge amount of competitive play, both in the side and main deck of historical and modern decks alike. It's a generally great utility card that's always going to be somewhat useful, and has the ability to counter any deck which wants to search specific cards, which just so happens to be most modern decks. Although as versatile as Mind Crush can be, the number 3 spot is even more versatile. And at number 3, we have Salesman, a recently released normal spell with an interesting range of uses and how it can impact both players. You can only activate 1 card of its name per turn, and when you do, you must declare 1 card name. And for the rest of this turn, your opponent cannot activate cards or the effects of cards with the same original name as the one you declared, and the same restriction also applies to you. But instead of just applying it until the end of the turn, you're locked out of that card's effect for the entire duel. Even purely on a superficial level, Salesman manages to have a ton of interesting utility, even if it can lock you out of using certain cards. For example, you can use Salesman as a blind going second tool to call either an opponent's boss monster, or an important back row card that you know that they might have set to lock your opponent out of that card for the turn, or force them to interact with Sylvan in some other manner. Or alternatively, you can use Sylvan to protect your own plays by calling a powerful hand trap that would either put a stop to your turn outright, like Nibiru the Primal Being, or Psy-Frame Gear Gamma before you make your plays and commit to the board to ensure that you're not interrupted. Both of which are pretty strong examples of where Sylvan can be obviously good, but it can also be used alongside some creative deck building choices. A good example is that you can combine Mystic Mind with Sylvan to lock your opponent out of monster effects completely, and is even played in Mystic Mind list as a versatile tech choice. As difficult as Mystic Mind can be to deal with a lot of decks, it actually comes with its own way to out it on the card itself. Control the same number of monsters as your opponent during the end phase of the turn. So if it's the first turn of the duel, and you activate Mystic Mind without putting a monster on board, it's guaranteed to destroy itself during the end phase, making the card virtually useless. However, if you happen to have Sylvan in your hand, you can activate Sylvan and declare Mystic Mind. And even though Mystic Mind's effect to destroy itself is mandatory, it can't be activated due to the particular restriction that Sylvan puts in place, preventing Mystic Mind from being destroyed and ensuring it's kept for the rest of the duel, locking your opponent out of monster effects entirely. And that's just one instance in which some creative deck building can be used alongside Sylvan. The card is a jack of all trades and can adapt to suit a particular situation, but as the saying goes, it's a master of none, and is never actually the best card for any particular situation. It doesn't really have the mass power of negation of a card like Dark Ruler No More, nor the sweeping power of a card like Harpy's Feather Duster. It can't be used reactively in response to a hand trap like Called by the Grave, and you must guess what hand trap your opponent has in hand before you make your plays in order for it to be an effective anti-hand trap tool. And even in the Mystic Mind example, Field Barrier is a lot stronger and can also protect your Mystic Mind from card effects like Twin Twisters. But despite all of this, its extreme versatility brings it to the number 3 spot. It may not be the best card for every situation, but its ability to adapt to different scenarios is almost prohibitively strong. And at number 2, we have Prohibition, a continuous spell card which actually inspires the theming and effect of Sylvan. You can activate Prohibition by declaring any card name, and while that copy of Prohibition is on the field, cards of the name and their effects cannot be used at all. But cards that are already on the field, including face-down cards, aren't affected by it, meaning that you can still use them. And just like with Psi-Blocker and Sylvan, Prohibition is a card with an extreme amount of versatility that is allowed to see a large amount of competitive play from its initial release even to the modern day. In terms of the modern game, you can use Prohibition in order to call a devastating hand trap that would otherwise end your turn before your opponent has a chance to activate it. Or more commonly, you can use Prohibition as a powerful side card when you know you're going first to lock your opponent out of a particular strong play starter, like Noah Punk Zia Min. And Prohibition has a specific advantage that its effect applies so long as it remains face up on the field. So unlike a card like Psi-Blocker, where its effect wears off during your opponent's end phase, Prohibition instead will lock him out of the declared card permanently, or at least until your opponent removes the card from the field with something like Mystical Space Typhoon. Now, in comparison to a card like Psi-Blocker, Prohibition's actual effect is technically worse due to it not affecting cards that are already on the field, even if they're already on the field. So if you're going second, a card like Psi-Blocker and Sylvan are actually way better than Prohibition, as they're also capable of affecting monsters that have already been on the field, and can lock your opponent out of important interactions that need to interrupt your plays, while Prohibition won't do anything to the cards already on board. However, Prohibition more than makes up for that with both how easy it is to use and how long-lasting its effect is. With Prohibition, you don't even need to get your normal summon in order to use it and can activate it directly from your hand, making it a card that any deck can theoretically take advantage of, while Psi-Blocker would need you to summon it to the field. And Sylvan, for as versatile as it is, only lasts a single turn. Meanwhile, Prohibition can prevent the card from being used entirely for the whole duel if your opponent doesn't have some way to out it, potentially floodgating them out of the game entirely in some instances. The ease of use and powerful floodgate effect are what allows it to see competitive play in the main and side deck from its initial release to the modern day, showcasing how well-rounded the card is in terms of strength and versatility, which is why it makes it the number 2 spot. But even with how powerful Prohibition is, there's still one more card in the game which declares an effect that just so happens to be even stronger. And at number 1, we have Crossout Designator, one of the strongest anti-hand trap cards in the game. Crossout is a quick play spell, and you can only activate one card of its name per turn, but when you do activate it, you must declare one card name, banish a card with that name from your own deck, and if you do, for the rest of the turn, the activated effects and effects on field of the card with the same original name are negated. In comparison to a lot of the other cards which declare card names, Crossout is one of those that demands the most in order to get the most use out of it. While something like Salesman can stop the activations of any card in the game, Crossout Designator requires that you have that card in your deck in order to negate it. So if you were to play a Pendulum deck which plays Crossout, and then you see your opponent is playing True Draco, you're not going to be able to negate their boss monster since you wouldn't be playing it in your deck. Or alternatively, if you're playing against a deck like Sharks, you wouldn't be able to use Crossout to negate Totally Awesome, because you wouldn't be able to banish an extra deck monster with the effect of Crossout. Yet despite what Crossout demands of you, it's still one of the best cards in the game, partially due to its quick play speed, and partially because of the way modern deck building works. See, the way decks are built in the current competitive game is that they use a main engine alongside a pseudo-generic cards in order to fill out a deck as extra interruptions. So if you're playing a Plunder Patrol deck, the deck's main engine is comprised of your Plunder Patrol cards, but as well as them, you can also play generically useful cards. And more often than not, some of the most generically useful cards in the games are hand traps. So most decks in the game often choose to use particular hand traps as a way to stop other decks in the meta. This is where Crossout Designator is at its strongest, because if everyone is playing a particular hand trap like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring or Infinite Impermanence, you're more likely to be interrupted by these cards and are more likely to be playing them. So if you activate the effect of your Shipyard and your opponent chains Ash, you can then activate Crossout Designator in response to that Ash Blossom in order to banish an Ash of your own in order to negate it as a Chainlink 3. So by the time your Shipyard resolves its Chainlink 1, Ash Blossom will have had no effect, making a premier tool in being able to stop hand traps after they've been activated. Meanwhile, with a card like Prohibition or Salesman, you need to guess what hand trap your opponent has before you make your plays, and if you just so happen to have been incorrect, you leave yourself open to the other hand traps while Prohibition and Salesman become less than useless. Whenever you use Crossout as an anti-hand trap card, its quick play speed allows it to be more effective counter to those cards since you know your opponent is activating it and can react accordingly to the hand trap rather than needing to guess what they have. And even though countering hand traps is Crossout main's use, that doesn't mean it's limited to just protecting your plays. For example, another key choice in generic engines is the Adventure engine, an engine centered around Rite of Armistier, which provides you with an extra negate. This engine is somewhat prevalent in the modern metagame as a generic choice to help boost certain decks that can play it. So if you just so happen to be playing the Adventure engine yourself, you can set Crossout Designator during your opponent's turn in order to respond to your opponent's Rite of Armistier by banishing a copy of your own from your deck when your opponent tries to activate theirs, giving it similar utility to Mind Crush while also still having the option to protect your plays. Crossout Designator is a genuinely strong card and has even been limited in the OCG for its power and versatility, even though it requires good knowledge of the metagame and what generic cards are being played in order to get the full use out of it. Its effect combined with the quick play speed makes it a force to be reckoned with, which is why it's the best card in the game, which declares card names. Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other cards that declare card names that we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.